going to continue our series. I did an introduction last week regarding the biblical Moses that Hollywood forgot, our exploration of the book of Exodus. And let's get now, having laid the foundations of theme and message and author and date and importance and backgrounds, let's now get into the text itself. We'll see here that Moses' narrative of Exodus is going to pick up exactly where he left off in the conclusion of Genesis, just as Genesis is the prerequisite, and understanding Genesis is prerequisite to understanding what's going on in Exodus. He makes it very clear by really leaving no daylight between the end of Genesis and the beginning of Exodus. And the first 4 verses here record the names of the sons of Jacob who came into Egypt with their families. And so from the outset, this text that Moses writes us establishes the Hebrew people's retention of their ancestry, their heritage, their relationship to God through His promises. Now, verse 1, these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob. They came each one with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. These children are grouped by birth seniority according to their mothers. Different mothers, right? And the 6 sons of Leah are listed first, followed by Rachel's son Benjamin. Joseph's not included in the list because he didn't come with Jacob into Egypt. He was already there, and the list concludes with the 4 sons of the handmaidens of Rachel and Leah's handmaids, Bilhah, Dan, and Naphtali, and Zilpah, Gad, and Asher. We get to the next verse. All the persons who came from the loins of Jacob were 70 in number, but Joseph was already in Egypt. So the Jewish patriarchs, with their old man, with their father, Jacob, moved their families to Egypt to be with Joseph. The 70 who came, Joseph's family already in Egypt. And Joseph died, and all his brothers, and all that generation. Of course, Joseph said to his brothers in Genesis, I'm about to die, but God will surely take care of you and bring you up from this land to the land which is promised on oath to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Genesis 50 ends with Joseph's reminder to his brothers and to us who are reading it, thanks to Moses, said, listen, when I die, bring me with you, because God will surely fulfill his covenant that he made with our fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. No question that there was a connection between Genesis and the Abrahamic covenant and what Moses is laying out at the beginning of Exodus. It's a seamless whole. But the sons of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. This language is very similar. Speaking of Genesis, this is very similar to what we see in the opening of Genesis, where the humanity is commanded to be fruitful and multiply. Right? And Israel is indeed doing this. And they're doing this in a foreign land, in the land of Egypt. And they became exceedingly mighty, so that the land was filled with them. So, in other words, the population of Jewish people explodes during their Egyptian sojourn. How many times does Moses use terms to emphasize that they are exploding their population? They're fruitful. They increased abundantly. They multiplied. They became exceedingly mighty. The land was 5 times in just this verse to tell us that the Jewish population doing pretty well. They are thriving in Egypt. Fantastic. So having established now the historical context, the background of what threads the needle between Genesis and the generation of Moses, the narrative moves us into the thick of the action. First with the Hebrews being subjugated to slavery, and then to genocide. And now, a new king arose over Egypt, a different kind, a pharaoh of a different kind, a pharaoh of a different dynasty. And this pharaoh arises, enough time has gone by, and the way the Egyptian dynasties work, there might not even have been any kind of a relation. So if the nation, the leadership of the nation, is not studying the history of the nation, then a leader arose who has no connection to the Pharaoh whom Joseph served. Joseph, remember, he saves Egypt. Right? Joseph is responsible for saving the entire Near East with preparing for the famine. But enough time goes by, and a nation who does not study its history is a nation condemned to ignorance. And this was what happens. A new king from a different dynasty arises, and he did not remember the economic nor political contribution of Joseph to the land of Egypt. This is probably the rise of the 18th dynasty in the 16th century BC, a couple hundred years after the Hebrews entered into the land of Egypt. Enough time goes by, and he says to his people, "Behold, the people of the sons of Israel, the nation of the sons of Israel, are more and mightier than we." This is Ahmose I, the 18th dynasty, most likely the Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. And he says this, "Come, let us deal shrewdly, wisely with them." He's identifying Israel's population explosion as a potential problem. There's no danger, of course, of the Hebrews outnumbering the Egyptian nationals. That's not going to happen. But nonetheless, the proportion of Hebrews to Egyptians was uncomfortable. The Egyptians were threatened. Why were they threatened? Because, well, after several centuries, the Hebrews had steadfastly resisted assimilation. They had avoided intermarriage with the Egyptians, and they had managed to retain their distinctive identity as Hebrews living in a foreign land. And so he says, let's make a shrewd plan. Let's make a wise plan. The wise plan, the shrewd plan of the Pharaoh was to enslave the Hebrews. Let us deal wisely with them, or else they will multiply. In the event of war, they will also join themselves to those who hate us. There'll be a potential fifth column in our midst and fight against us and depart from the land. The previous dynasties, in between the Pharaoh of the time of Joseph and this particular Pharaoh, there was a separate, different grouping, a parenthetical set of dynasties. And a Semitic people we know as the Hyksos actually ruled over Egypt. And so you can see how the Egyptians are nervous about having Semites in their midst, since the Hyksos too were Semites. And so if the Hyksos return, they will fight against us and will be in trouble. And so they appointed taskmasters over them to afflict the Hebrews with hard labor. And they built for Pharaoh storage cities, Pithom and Ramses. So labor gangs, in other words, set over the Israelites to abuse them, to subjugate them, to humiliate them. And so this slavery of the Hebrews, not only a means to build grand cities for Pharaoh, storehouses to make real the dreams of the Egyptian architects, but the servitude of the Hebrews was going to serve as a prophylactic in any kind of campaign that foreign nations might have. They will be too busy building cities. They are in servitude. They won't have any time to rebel. And the implication in this, and so as we see the Hebrews are enslaved, this is the latest possible date that they could be enslaved is 18th dynasty, 1569 BC, and it's very possible that they were enslaved prior to this. But they're not slaves for 400 years, because you've got some time from the time of Joseph to the time of Moses. It's a whole, Joseph to Moses is 400 years. And so they're obviously not enslaved for 400 years. It's a matter of how many years were they multiplying, were they thriving before they were enslaved. So we'll look at the map. The cities of Ramses and Pithom are right here in the Nile Delta, beautiful area, and we'll see that map again as we continue with our story. Verse 12, but the more they afflicted them, the more the Hebrews multiplied, and the more they spread out, so that the Egyptians were in dread of the sons of Israel. So Pharaoh assumed, and you can understand why he thought this, that if he increased the Israelites' workload sufficiently, they would be too exhausted to procreate. The population of the Hebrews is eventually going to be reduced, or at least will be controlled. Right? But the text shares with us the Egyptians' frustration at seeing, contrary to all expectations, the sexual potency of the Israelites increased in direct proportion to the amplified burden. Give them more work, and they get more fertile. And so they were in dread. They were unhinged. And their distrust of the Hebrews now turns to loathing. The Egyptians compelled the sons of Israel to labor rigorously, and they made their lives bitter with hard labor. The word for bitter is moror. That's what we eat at Passover. The bitter herbs, the moror, the bitter, the concept of the bitterness, of the bondage of the Israelites is going to be emphasized for the next 3,500 years in the Passover Seder. The slaves' labor becomes progressively more arduous, made their lives bitter with hard labor, mortar and bricks, and in all kinds of labor in the field. So they're not only building, but they're now farming, and they have agricultural duties, like pumping the waters of the Nile into the fields to irrigate them. We find this out in Deuteronomy. But you see all kinds of labor in the field. All their labors, which they rigorously imposed on them. So the Hebrews are working hard, and Moses gives the implication that as hard as the Hebrews are working, being enslaved, the Egyptians are working just as hard in rigorously imposing these labors upon them. A cycle of destruction. In Deuteronomy 11, the land which you're entering to possess it, not like the land of Egypt from which you came. And this gives us some insight as to what they did there, where you used to sow your seed and water it with your foot like a vegetable garden. Then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives. After 40 years or so, generation, it becomes clear to the Egyptian government that if we're looking at curbing the Hebrew population rate, enslavement is ineffective. It becomes very clear that more drastic measures were needed if they were going to achieve the desired result. And so in 1526, either as the final orders of the previous Pharaoh, Amenhotep I, or the initial order of his successor, Thutmose, a new policy of genocide is implemented against the Hebrews. And so the Pharaoh speaks to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom is named Shiphrah, the other named Puah. I want you to notice that when we talk about Pharaoh throughout the book of Exodus, it would appear to the casual reader that no matter how much time is going by, you only have one Pharaoh, right? Because the Pharaoh, the king's name, is actually never given. You have Hebrew midwives' names given, but you never have the names of the pharaohs given. One is interchangeable with another, apparently, but it's simply not important. It's like reading the history of World War II and Hitler never being mentioned by name, simply given the term the Chancellor. And we just refer to him as the Chancellor or the Fuhrer, whatever. But this king of Egypt, he wants to involve the midwives to curb the population rate. Shiphrah and Puah. This is Amenhotep I, probably the guy we're talking about, the pharaoh of the genocide. This will be one of the last things that he does. And he says to the ladies, when you are helping the Hebrew women to give birth. Now, most likely these are Egyptian midwives who are helping the Hebrews. It's possible that they're Hebrew, but the fact that he engages them in this plan of genocide would seem to indicate that they're not Jewish people collaborating with him to destroy their own people, but they're Egyptian overseers of the midwives, and there's got to be more midwives than just two for this population explosion. These are the guys in charge. When you're helping the Hebrew women to give birth, and they see them on their birthing stools, if it's a son, put him to death. If it's a daughter, then she will live. So, new policy, genocide, murder the Hebrew children, only the males, not a monster after all, and you'll murder them immediately upon birth. Right? They will achieve this goal. How are they going to do it? By subtly making it appear as if the baby boys were stillborn. Right? That's why you needed the midwives to carry out this sinister task. Just a rash of stillborn deaths that only affect the males. So Pharaoh is going to use far less subtle tactics later on. The baby girls were allowed to live. why let the baby girls live and just kill the males? Well, the rationale behind this insidious policy is that in the ancient world, nationality was determined through patrilineal descent, through the father. Hebrew identity could not be passed on if there was a dearth of fertile young Hebrew men. So this is a way of forcing an entire generation of future Hebrew women into a position where they would either remain childless or assimilate into the Egyptian nation by marrying Egyptian men. So, this is the birthing stool for those of you who, well, why do you need two midwives and how does it work? Well, there's some ancient illustrations of how it did work, dating from the ancient world. There you have it. That's how it was done. No epidural required. But the midwives feared God. Well, that really can put a crimp in someone's grand extermination program. The fear of God. And if the fear of God is greater than the fear of Pharaoh, well, there's a real problem. And they did not do as the king of Egypt had commanded them, but they let the boys live. So here we have one of the great concepts in the book of Exodus. The Lord is more powerful than Pharaoh. Pharaoh is powerful, but the Lord is more powerful. And because the Lord is more powerful than Pharaoh, he is more worthy of obedience. So if these two great powers, the king of Egypt and the king of the world, if they are in conflict, you go with the king of the world rather than the king of Egypt. And so watch this response. King of Egypt called for the midwives and said, "Why have you done this thing and let the boys live? Why have you disobeyed?" So the midwives develop a shrewd plan of their own, which involves lying directly to the king's face. They lie right to Pharaoh. And they make an outrageous yet plausible claim. Midwives said to Pharaoh, "Well, here's how it's going down, O king. The Hebrew women, they are not as the Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwife can get to them. So we're called, the woman's going to labor pains. By the time we get there, she's already delivered." Right? The Hebrew women are more like animals in the field. And we simply cannot deliver their children. They drop before we get there. Right? So pretty shrewd. So the Hebrews, they're not like us. They're not like the Egyptian women. You know, they're not cultivated. They don't take a long time. God was good to the midwives. The people multiplied, became very mighty. I thought they already were mighty. Well, they become mightier. They become more numerous, even so. Because the midwives feared God, he established households for them. So God blesses the midwives for their decision to protect the children. But the midwives' decision to protect the children involved lying. And there's no getting around this. This is not like, half truth is a whole lie, or this is not like a little white lie. This is like a absolute out and out lie. And God blessed her. I thought lying is wrong. Lying is not wrong under certain circumstances. Right? Lying is a noble course of action when it protects life. when lying protects life, it is a noble course of action. It is the noble course of action. And precedent is established that God actually blesses this lie. God blessed the deception because Jewish lives were saved, and they were rewarded with prosperous families. It's not established households, families for them. So, as the Israelites were fertile, so too now these midwives became very fertile and established great homes. But again, the fertility of the Israelites was ratcheted up another level. And now Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, every son who is born, you are to cast into the Nile. And every daughter you are to keep alive. There's an immediate implementation of a malevolent plan B. Pharaoh, who tried to cover up the murder of baby boys by engaging the midwives and trying to make it subtle and sneaky and, ooh, another stillbirth. How about that? He dispenses with any pretext of subtlety or sneakiness, and he executes a general order to the Egyptian populace at large. We're not going to rely on a little group of midwives here who may or may not be pulling my royal leg with this Hebrew women are vigorous nonsense. Let me get all the people involved. So, kings are responsible, leaders are responsible for their nations, right? People are held responsible for the actions of their leaders. But the action of Pharaoh was simply words. Pharaoh himself did not get out there and say, baby boys born, got it, is there a boy? Yep, into the Nile you go. Who was necessary for the baby boys to be drowned in the Nile? The Egyptian people. Leaders only have authority in so much as the people obey their orders. And the Egyptians most assuredly obey the orders that every son is to be cast into the Nile, daughters keep alive. So every Jewish baby boy that the Egyptians can lay their murderous hands on is to be drowned in the Nile River. This is why when Moses comes back to Pharaoh and 40 years hence, skipping forward a little bit, and you have these disasters, the plagues that come upon Egypt, it's not just a Pharaoh who suffers. It's not just the royal house that suffers. It's the entire nation that suffers. Because the Egyptian people shared in the malevolent responsibility of murder of the Jewish people. Genocide. So, in other words, when the plagues eventually come upon the Egyptian nation, God is not unjust. It's very just indeed for the people to receive penalty for what they have done to the Jewish people. So now, that's as far as we're going to go today, chapter 1. Let's look at a couple of themes here. We have the theme of God protecting and blessing the Jewish people in difficult circumstances, yes, which makes complete sense considering what we saw through and through Genesis, God's plan and program and promises to bring the Jewish people back from the matrix of Egypt, where they're going to be formed as a nation, and bring them to the promised land. So we see that. But we also see the first time we see a tremendous example of civil disobedience. Shiphrah and Puah, these midwives, and whether you want to take them as Jewish midwives or Egyptian midwives serving the Hebrew people, doesn't really matter. Bottom line is, we remember their names because of what they did, which was to resist the evil of the government of the time. And because they resisted the evil of the government of their time, they are blessed by God. So what does that have to do with us? I'm not a midwife. I'm not Egyptian. Is there relevance to the action of the Egyptian midwives, of these midwives, to my life today? I'd say, yeah, the answer is absolutely yes. If the government, and government is established by God, Romans 13, right? If the government is commanding, if the law of the land is commanding something that is contrary to the eternal, ethically absolute Word of God, because God is more powerful than government, God is then more worthy of obedience. So it comes down to obeying an unjust law and disobeying the Lord, or obeying the Lord and disobeying an unjust, you're going to obey the Lord. Okay? And that may have costs. The Egyptian, these midwives, they didn't know how their shrewd plan before Pharaoh was going to play out. They could just as easily have said, well, the Hebrew women are vigorous, and by the time we get there, the baby boys are already born. We miss out on your shrewd plan. And Pharaoh could have said, poppycock, right? Arrest these women, kill them for disobedience. They took that risk, right? They trusted God. They feared God. So we talk a lot in circles today about loving God and having a relationship with God. It's all very good. It's all important stuff. But these midwives feared God. They had a healthy respect. And their healthy respect for God, their awe of God, created a perspective for them that helped them navigate the ethical shoals of their life. They were in rough waters, no question. But they were able to navigate those rough waters because they understood who God was. And they feared Him. That does not mean that they were afraid of Him. Oh, God terrorizes me. No, that's not what that term means. It means they had a healthy awe. They had right-sized thinking for an infinite-sized God. Pharaoh was powerful, but his power was limited. The Lord's power, unlimited. And so they chose that day, and for many days thereafter, as this program of genocide was attempted to be carried out, these midwives had opportunity day after day after day to decide who do we fear more, the government or God? And their decision was God. Very few of us have been put into a situation where we've been, by law, commanded to do something that is, because of our nation, our laws, contrary to the moral laws of God. But if we are, it is best ahead of time to think through your positions. What would you do if you were put into the... It's super hard to identify with these midwives, for example, because so little is given. It's like once upon a time, there was a midwife named Pua, and she had a friend named Shifra, and they lived in, you can identify with a story like that, you can identify, and one had blonde hair and one had brown, you could really, but they weren't Disney princesses. And so we have to work a little bit to identify with them, but we're absolutely, Moses, without question, has designed the narrative so that we are to identify with them. We know that because God blessed them afterward for what they did. So they're held up for us as an example to follow, a noble example. So I don't know what the future holds, my friends, but I do know that we live in a culture that is being tossed about at an exponential rate, and turmoil, and upheaval, and I just don't know what the future holds. Certain things that one could count on in the past may not be the constants that they were in decades past. And our cultural upheaval, which and cultural wars that are continuing even as we speak, there's no way of knowing how they will turn out. And so let us look to just a simple first chapter of Exodus to give us some insight as to what God in His Word lays out as the noble course of action if it comes down to having to decide between government and God. Government, God. Choosing government, there might be some rewards. Might be in our immediate best interest. But I promise that our long-term best interest is always going to be best served by choosing the Word of God and choosing what God says is right instead of disobeying that. And when it comes down certainly to saving lives, there's no question. Not only Jewish lives, but lives, period. So if we need to lie, if we need to misrepresent, who knew that you're going to hear a pastor saying this kind of stuff? If we need to lie, if we need to misrepresent in order to save lives, now is the time to start thinking about what you would do, okay, in the future. Does that make sense? All right. The book of Exodus is a timeless book for us because we live in a cyclical, historical confluence of events. And humanity is humanity. And as bad as it was in the time of Pharaoh and Moses and the Hebrews, I believe we're in like a toilet drain that circles and swirls until eventually it goes down into the sewer. I believe our culture is headed slowly down into the sewer. Right? And so it's getting worse. So if it's getting worse, the one thing that we can depend upon is our God and His Word. So we stand on that, and we plant our legs, and we plant ourselves, and we say, here we stand, and we can do no other. Well, man, what will we see in the future? What's chapter 2 going to bring to us? We haven't even met Moses yet, and we're already talking about civil disobedience. Where are we going to go from here? The suspense is killing me. I think it's time for some prayer. Our Father and our God, our culture needs help. We, the church, need help to have the courage, the backbone, to have the moral fortitude, certitude, and compass, simply the compass, to always understand, Lord. Help us to always understand where true north lies. And that's with you. Help us always, Lord, to stand for truth and for your grace, and for your love. Help us, Lord, to speak truth. It's a lot of pressure, God. We're all under a lot of pressure. Man, people won't like us. People will fire. We say the wrong thing. We can lose our job. We stand for, I'm not talking about saying silly things, but I mean standing for truth. We see it happening in other countries. People are being sued. People lose their jobs. People lose their well-being, and they're hated for standing up for what is true. So give us, O Lord, clarity of mind and of heart, backbone, courage, Lord, so that we can represent you in a world that's being turned upside down, shaken, stirred, in a confused culture. May we be a blessing, O Lord. May we never embarrass you. May we never be ashamed to stand for you. And it's in the name of Yeshua we pray.